Lee was born April 25th, 1979, and 13 months later his brother Craig was born July 8th, 1980, to mother Julie Richardson. Julie was a good mom for Lee and Craig. She did a lot of nice things for the boys, and she was just a great lady. And Father Colin was a really good father also, and that attributes to good children, right? And Lee and Craig were very good children, and they had good upbringing because of their parents. Father Colin, he was a commentary for this company called Screen Sport. It was before Eurosport, and he was doing commentary for, I guess, the Speedway races. The company Screen Sport, they needed a presenter, and they went to Colin and they asked, like, who are we gonna get? And Colin looked at Julie and said, we're gonna get my wife. So Julie went ahead and worked for a few years over at the Screen Sport, and she was a commentary. She did Speedway, ice racing. She did other various events. She was really involved in the motorsports. Julie worked for Screen Sport from 1987 to 1989, and then Eurosport came in, and then Julie, she went away. But she was involved in Speedway quite a bit, and she was kind of a popular celebrity in her time. We're going to relate a few stories about the Speedway rider Lee when he was just a little toddler. He had some very exciting events because he was raised around the Speedway world. His papa was a member of several teams and was always at the races. And young Lee, he grew up around Speedway. So many of you have been texting me and telling me all the exciting stories about how good Lee was, what a friendly guy he was. He was a personable guy, and he would just sign autographs for anyone. Lee Richardson was just an amazing guy, and it all stems from family, right? If you have a good family, it sort of rubs off on the children sometimes. And with Lee Richardson, his family definitely rubbed off on him. The year 1984. Lee was just a toddler at age 5, and he just loved everything about motorcycles, Speedway. He was destined to be a Speedway star. His papa, Colin, was a racer for the Eastbourne Speedway team, and he was a good rider, and he was well respected in the Speedway community. One night, the American Speedway star Bobby Schwartz, he was racing for the Eastbourne team at the time. He was in the locker room, I guess it was, and the boys, Craig and Lee, they walked in. It was a cold night in England. It's usually cold in England when the season starts. And they had these long sheepskin coats. They're very beautiful. And Bobby Schwartz looked at the boys. They were just 5 years old or 6 years old. And Bobby Schwartz said, I like that coat, man. It looks real cool. The Eastbourne team, they just loved what Bobby said. And anytime that Lee and Craig, they would walk around with those coats, the boys loved those coats. That was their favorite coats from then on. And the racers would always make comments regarding the coats, and they would say, you're wearing those cool coats. And the boys, they just loved it. At age 3, Colin, he purchased a Yamaha, 2 of them, PW50, the little bikes for the kids. And the boys just rode that bikes around, and they had a good time. They'd ride in the garden, they would race, they would steal the dad's equipment. It's raining here too. And they would just have a good time. They enjoyed riding motorcycles. They had a bicycle, a BMX bike their dad bought, but they didn't really like it that much. They didn't know how to ride a bicycle. The boys just knew how to ride a motorcycle. And on that bicycle, they had a training wheels. They're only 3 years old at the time. They're riding those PW50s, and they just didn't really like riding the bicycles, I guess. Lee and Craig, they asked their dad, could we take these PW50s to the Speedway track? They wanted to be like their papa. They wanted to haul those bikes in the back of the pickup truck. They wanted to take them to the races. They wanted to show everyone that they were future Speedway stars. And the dad kind of reluctantly maybe said, okay. So they he loaded all the Speedway bikes and then made a little room for those little PW50s. They went off to the races. Paul and Martin Duggart, they would take care of the boys while Dad was racing. He obviously couldn't take care of the boys. He was racing on the Eastbourne team at the time. And Paul and Martin would take care of the boys. They would take them to a nearby track just behind the stadium there. And it was a kiddie track for the small bikes. And the boys would ride. It was a track owned by Alan Johns. And the boys just loved it. And they had their first races there at that track. And they just had a good time. They loved that more than going to the Speedway races, maybe. And then Grandpa did it. It's always Grandpa. It's Grandpa's fault. He went ahead and he built a custom-made Honda 125 Speedway bike. He built the frame. Now the boys are little Speedway riders. They're just like 5 or 6 years old. They're little toddlers. And the boys said, you know, Dad, we want those Speedway bikes to go to the Speedway races. We want the PW50s to go there. And they just went ahead, and the dad was probably like, oh no, what did I get into? And Lee just loved to ride. He loved to race. He was over at that little practice track and riding. They just enjoyed riding. And that's where they started their development and their love for racing. As you can tell, the Richardson family was a Speedway family. And they just had a good time with Speedway. And by the age of 6, young Lee, he went ahead and started crying to his papa. He was crying, and his papa said, you know, what's wrong, Lee? And Lee said,
my brother, he pushed me off the racetrack and he hurt me, and he did it on purpose.
And Lee was very upset. He couldn't believe that somebody would ride rough while riding a motorcycle. Alan, who cared for the boys while the papa was riding for the Eastbourne team, he got mad. He got mad because they got in a fight too. Like, they were punching each other. And Alan said, time out, boys. Time out. He said, you're gonna both have a 1-week suspension from the racetrack. No bikes coming next week. And the boys, they probably began to cry. That's probably where Lee learned that you have to have good sportsmanship to ride a motorcycle. You gotta be a good sport. You gotta not fight. You gotta be, in some aspect, you gotta be respectful of others. One day while Lee was riding on that little racetrack, Dad was racing, a local TV news team came and they interviewed young Lee. They asked Lee, like, what are you doing here? And he says, my dad races over there in that stadium next door. And they said, oh, your dad's a racer. And he said, yeah, he's a good racer too. And then the news anchor asked, like, are you gonna ride motorcycles one day, young man? And Lee's like 6 years old, right? And he said, of course I'm gonna ride. I ride right now. Can't you see? I'm on this track. And they said, no, I mean, are you gonna ride when you get like older, when you get to be like your dad? Are you gonna be? And he said, of course I'm gonna be a Speedway rider when I get bigger. And the announcer was thinking, like, what are we gonna talk about? Well, what are your goals? What are you gonna do when you get older? What's the things that you wanna accomplish as a Speedway rider? Because everyone knew about Speedway, because Speedway was right next door. And young Lee, he said,
I'm gonna be world champion.
And young Lee fulfilled that promise of being a world champion. He was the under 21 world champion, 1999. Young Lee Richardson, from the humble beginnings of riding that Pee Wee W50 to that 125 Honda Speedway bike that Grandpa built him, young Lee had the heart, he had the drive, he had the desire to be a Speedway rider. And as he grew up in stature and years, he knew that one day that's what he would be, a Speedway star, and that he would entertain thousands of people, and he would do great things on a Speedway track. And it all came true.